It's okay. I know. Banging noise. Apparently I scared my dog. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another Glacial Geek Deep Thoughts Thin Coats with me, Phil the Glacial Geek. Coming to you here from the Flare once again. That's Harold in the background. You can kind of see his tail flopping around there. Today I am going to be working on probably priming my last sanguinary guard guy to catch him up, because I'd been waiting for his fist. See, it's a blue one. I've been waiting for that I've been looking around for a friend, and finally a friend found one and was generous enough to give it to me, so now I can finally get all of the guys that I need for my list, like kind of what I want to run with them, because the plan is one squad with all fists, a 4-man, and then one squad with all swords, so I'll be good to go hopefully at that point. As you can see on these guys, I just kind of went ahead and started painting. So I did the gold. I'm trying something new here. Usually I leave all of the highlighting to the end, but for these guys I did a dry brush on the highlight with the Auric Gold. Yes, Auric Gold. So for that dry brush, it would get onto the other parts that I had painted that I usually base coat first and then do the washes. So now my thought is maybe give it a shot here, finish up this gold armor, and then do the dry brush, and then go in and do the rest of the painting. And then, because even if you have a little bit that you just have to cover it up with the Retributor Gold, it's not going to make a big deal that there's a little bit that's not highlighted, especially on my stuff. I mean, my stuff is tabletop plus at best. So I got ahead with those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get this guy to the same point as the other ones, so that I can continue on with the rest of these guys together, doing each of the different bits together. I think it'd be a fair thing to do. So. So that's what I'm going to be working on hobby-wise. As far as the topic of discussion today, there's a big one. The big one, the big FAQ that came out this week. It threw a lot of people for a loop, including me. I was actually in the dead middle of, or not dead middle, I was in the beginning stages of filming a battle report when it released. I had scheduled a battle report with a guy for 11 o'clock on Monday, got there, and then all of a sudden some messages, everything starts spreading around that the FAQ's coming out at 11:30. So, we set everything up. We did the army intro, filmed the army intro, took care of that, and then all of a sudden, and then we decided we were going to wait till the FAQ came out, because it was like 20 minutes at that point. So we just hung around, chatted for a bit. And then when the FAQ dropped, suddenly my list was 40 points over because the Dark Talon got bumped up. So my opponent, he was playing Necron, so he just took another squad of 3-man squad of Scarabs, which was 40 points, and made it even at that point. So that was very generous of him that I didn't have to go and start messing around with my list. So we played a 1,540 point game. As opposed to a 1,500 point game just because of the FAQ. So there were some big changes in the FAQ, and if you base it upon the reaction of the internet to the FAQ, I mean, Warhammer is either dead or finally worth playing, depending upon who you see talking. A lot of people want to go back to all sorts of different things, and it was a weird reactions that everyone had to this. It seemed like the whole freaking place just like rioted. It was nuts. All the arguments and the discussions that got heated, and people saying their armies are unplayable now. It was, in my opinion, a lot of it was an overreaction, honestly. Even if your army is dependent upon Deep Strike, they didn't take away Deep Strike. So let's touch on some of the major topics of the FAQ before I go into specific to go into discussion about them. The couple of big things that they had were all of the beta rules that they've been working with. So the character beta rule and the beta rule for the smite, they got adopted as full-fledged rules. So that was always one of my things. Is I had always assumed that they were going to do that. So when you had a lot of people talking about how, it's beta rules, we're not going to play with beta rules until they're full rules. In my opinion, when they said they were beta rules, they were rules, and the whole point was to get some play testing in. And if you're not going to play it, with those rules until they've become finalized, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage, because now all of a sudden they're official rules, and if you don't play with them, or if you haven't played with them, you're now going to be stuck, and your tactics are behind. So especially like the character rule that got adopted, it's exactly as it was. So there were no changes made to that. The smite rule did have a few changes. They changed it so that now Grey Knights, Brotherhood of Psychers, and Thousand Sons, Brotherhood of Sorcerers, they got exempt from the +1 to the warp charge cost for smite every time you use it. So they did change it slightly. So I guess maybe if you were a Grey Knight player, you didn't have to play with those rules, but everyone else that was playing didn't play with those rules. Now they're official rules, and if you didn't play with them, now you're going to have to learn how to play with them, as opposed to have spending the time when everyone was learning how to play with them to figure it all out. But yeah, so those rules got adopted, which is pretty big. I think good. They were good changes. I'd been playing with them since they came out as beta rules, and I enjoyed it. I think they were good. Not hiding behind other characters meant that you couldn't just screen out with a Calexis assassin making you hit on 6s. Now all of a sudden it was I could target any of your characters. So you just had to be careful about it. Changed the way you would move things. So as opposed to just slopping that one Calexis assassin in the front and then everyone else just kind of doing their thing, you now had to be careful about placement. Make sure you have something. If you have someone that you just do not want to get shot, you may have to make sure that you had something that was either over 10 wounds, if it was a character, or just not a character, that was closer, and you'd be good to go. So they adopted those rules. They also started up some other beta rules, which those new beta rules, the ones that came in, are the ones that are really freaking a lot of people out. One of the ones that they put in is the fact that now no unit can be set up on first turn. You cannot deploy a unit. You cannot set up a unit outside of your deployment zone. So if a unit is being set up on the table on their first turn, they have to being set up on the table on the first turn. They have to be set up wholly within your deployment zone, which is a big deal. I think it's a big deal because what it does is it means that all those first turn deep strikes that a lot of people were doing with, obliterators or most a lot of like blood angels, for instance, those are now no longer going to be allowed. So now it's turn 2. You can still deep strike, so don't get me wrong. So if you're going second and all of a sudden your opponent just like fast moved into your deployment zone and you need some support back there, you're completely free to drop your own guys back in your own deployment zone for support. It's also a good way to keep them off the board first turn in case you don't get first turn, so you can drop them down in your own deployment zone and have them be able to do their job without having to worry about them being shot off before you get to do anything with them. So a lot of the things they were talking about, people would use deep strike just to protect their units, not necessarily to get them further up the field. That kind of tactic is totally usable, totally good to go. The only thing is that more of assault oriented deep strikers did get a little bit of a nerf, if you will, to being able to use first turn deep strike. So it's an important key here. I think that this is a fine rule. I think that when you look at 8th edition, everyone keeps talking about 8th edition being the edition of the Alpha Strike. And they keep talking about how first turn is so important now. Like, you need to worry about first turn, getting Alpha struck up the board, worrying about all these things that are going on. And you look at the game, you look at 8th edition, you look at 7th edition, and the big difference is turn 1 deep strike. I mean, if you look at the mechanics are similar. You know, I don't think that everything wounding on 6s now is the reason that you have Alpha Strike capabilities. The different armies rules, I mean, Tau was always able to shoot, Guard were always able to shoot. All of these things existed in 7th edition. The big difference now between 7th edition and 8th edition, you still took turns, you still rolled off to see who went first. Like, all of these things happened in 7th edition. The big difference is that first turn deep strikes weren't a thing until the very end of 7th edition with some formations that everyone thought were overpowered. Like the Skyhammer Annihilation Force, first turn deep strike coming in and shooting. I had a lot of people that didn't like seeing that across the table when I would bring it to tournaments, understandably so, because that first turn deep strike was very effective. It was very good, and it did a lot of work. And now going into 8th edition, they made first turn deep strikes a thing for everybody. So everyone could have these first turn deep strikes. And what it created was the situation where everyone's afraid of this alpha striking situation. So, I mean, they had to do something, because that's literally the biggest thing that people have been griping about with 8th edition is the fact that Alpha Strike is so strong in this edition. The fact that that first turn makes such a big difference, and a lot of people are like, you lose auto lose if you don't get first turn. And I mean, I don't think that's true, but I mean, if you look on the internet, that's what everyone keeps talking about. It's like, if I had gone first, I could have won, because that's the only reason I lost was because I went second. I mean, you didn't just lose because you went second; you lost because you lost. But first turn made a big difference. So when you look at that, you see that situation, and you see that the big change that happened between 7th and 8th that could affect this is first turn deep strike, first turn coming in from reserves, and auto come in from reserves. So that was a big difference, is that is automatically coming in from reserves and first turn coming in from reserves. Suddenly now you take a look at that and you go, well, maybe this had something to do with it. And I think it did. I think if you look at it, there was so many units that weren't on the table that you couldn't deploy against, that could just drop in first turn, shoot the crap out of you, or drop in first turn, spend a bunch of stratagems and get like auto assaults on you, and that becomes a major issue. So GW put in this beta FAQ, this beta rule, saying that first turn you can deep strike still first turn deep strike allowed. So if you just want to hold somebody off the board and you still want them in your deployment zone, you can still drop them down turn 1 without a problem. You can't deep strike outside of your deployment zone first turn. So now second turn, everything's back to normal. So you automatically can come in, you can drop them wherever you want to, and everything's got to be in by by the end of turn 3 again. But that's just the way it is. So now you have a situation where you give a buffer for that first turn. So you give armies a chance to actually do something in response to some of these more aggressive deep strike situations. And I think that it's going to go a long way to alleviating the whole first turn dominance situation, because this is the big difference that occurred between 7th and 8th that really could have affected the fact that there's this major alpha strike dilemma that you're facing. So with that in mind, I think that this is going to create it. Does it completely neuter deep strike assault armies? Does it completely neuter demon armies or any of these things? I don't think so. I don't think it completely neuters it. It does require you to start to think about things differently. And just like any change that occurs in the game, it requires you to take a step back and think about it, So yeah, be shocked, because I mean, I don't think anyone saw this one coming. I mean, well, I bet you some people did, but most people did not see this coming. So I think that's more where you see these massive reactions online are people having these reactions to it because of the fact that they just didn't see it coming. You also started to see a lot of arguments about whether rules like on Wings of Fire or the jump, if they count as if they're affected by this new beta rule. My personal opinion is that they are affected by this because if you look in the FAQ, when they talk about units that are removed from play and redeployed on the battlefield because of stratagems or special rules, which would be like the jump or Gates of Infinity or any of those, that GW has consistently said that you treat them as though they're coming from reserves. So you have it for movement purposes, for shooting for heavy weapons. They've said in the FAQ. They've said it in FAQ about Auspex scan. So in my opinion, the fact is that part of the tactical reserves beta rule doesn't specify that they need to be coming from reserves. All it says is that a unit cannot be deployed on a player's first turn outside of their deployment zone. And what it is if all these special rules that say remove the unit from the board, at that point they're not on the board. So this isn't just a movement. So it's not like you get an extra movement. All of those rules are fine. You could double move all you want into your opponent's zone first turn or outside of your deployment zone first turn. All you want. You're allowed to. There's no problems with that. I think that, but because you're removing them from the board, it means that you then have to deploy them again. And the rule for this new beta rule specifically talks about deploying units outside of your deployment zone first turn, as opposed to just saying coming in when they come in from reserves and need to be deployed. It just talks about deploying units. And when they're removed from the play, they need to be deployed. So I think that all of those rules are still caught up in this beta rule because of that. I think that there's still, I can see arguments back and forth where it's like they were deployed first turn, but these new rules require you to deploy them again. Usually in the course of a game, you're not allowed to remove them from the board and put them back down on the board. But it's not just a movement. You're not just moving them on the table. It's you remove them from the board and then you have to deploy them again. So I do think that it's caught up in that. That's my opinion. Obviously, we're going to have to see if GW comes out and says one way or the other what they intended for that. I think that if they do allow it, it's an interesting situation where they're considered coming from reserves for every single situation except for this beta rule. But I guess we'll find out. We'll see what happens there. So yeah, that's caused a lot of contention. I don't think it ruins it. I think it requires a rethinking of strategy. So for instance, I'm still building up my Blood Angel Bros. I still think that these guys are going to be very effective for me because they're going to allow me to get some board movement and board control in the game. And obviously my initial plan was first turn drop them in and use them either as a distraction Carnifex or as like a beat stick to make them go up there and handle situations. Now they're going to be coming in turn 2, and I don't think that's a huge it's a change. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's just a change. So now what I have to do is I have to deploy so that I can set myself up for whatever my opponent has on the board and understand that it's going to change come turn 2. So my focus now is going to be shoot away screens so that I have a clear lane of fire, a clean lane of approach for my for my guys to jump in and hopefully get in on the charge. Because now I'm going to have that first turn where the only things I have to handle are basically the things that are on the board. Sure, my opponent can drop things back in their deployment zone, but essentially I'm just going to have to face the things that are coming at me from that are coming at me from the table. So now I can deploy in and work with a strategy that I know what I'm facing that first turn. And honestly, I think that's the key to why this is going to affect the whole Alpha Strike, is that the Alpha Strike was people being able to be caught unaware of what they were going to face that first turn. So if your opponent has most of their has I guess half their army now in Deep Strike, you can't deploy in response to that. You also can't deploy. You also can't come up with a strategy of how to respond to what's on there until you see what they do. So it required you to think a lot faster, and oftentimes if you're thinking a lot faster, you're not thinking as thoroughly as you could if you're watching it unfold during deployment. And that led to a lot of armies just getting beat down that first turn when they would drop down from Alpha Strike. They would drop down from Deep Strike reserves, and suddenly it's like, oh, I left that one little pocket in my back zone where you could fit those 3 obliterators. Great. Now they're coming in there and they just killed all of my guys in the background. Great. So now I'm Alpha struck, and now there's very little chance of me being able to respond. I'll try, but I'm at a disadvantage at that point. Now you have your first turn where those obliterators aren't dropping in behind you to kill all of your characters. They're now going to be dropping in turn 2, or they could drop them into their own deployment zone if they want. But at that point, you've got your front-facing force that can go against them. And if they're going to try to deploy them behind you again, yeah, that you could still leave that hole for them to drop down, but you've had an entire turn to use those units that would have been killed by those obliterators to now be able to do things on the table and shoot and do whatever else that they do. It is going to change, I think, the way that I set up. I think now my scouts are probably going to be used in backline deployment, so that I use them in the back end of my deployment zone to help, guard against Deep Strike. And then I'll have the rest of my army in front of them, so that turn 1 I can move my army up and thus push out my realm of board control and push out the bubble of denial to Deep Strike, while still being able to leave my scouts, who I don't need to run up and get into better shooting range or get into the fight. I can leave them back there for the second or third turn to wait to respond to any Deep Strike, so that I know that my back end is properly secured against Deep Strikers. I just need to I don't need those scouts to be pushing forward, because the reason you would push them forward in the first turn is if you're going second, you needed to push out the bubble of denial beyond your deployment zone, so to keep your opponent's Deep Strikers from being able to get in as getting close to you. Now that I can move the rest of my army up to make that point of denial up front, I can leave my scouts behind because to hold off against second turn or third turn Deep Strikes, because they're effectively there for screening. That's why I have my scouts. They're a cheap troop choice, and they're really good at just taking up real estate to screen out Deep Striking. So now if I have that back there, they're going to deny this Deep Strike. I also am not really hamstringing myself by holding back my forces to respond to it. I can now move forward with whatever I've got that I need to move forward with and push out my realm of denial, still keep myself safe and screened from Deep Strike, and then turn 2 comes along, I respond to their Deep Strike, and I bring in my own Deep Strikes. So yeah, it's a change to my tactics, and that's what it's going to require. It's going to require people to think differently about how their army operates. It's going to require people to respond differently, and it's going to require people to maybe build lists differently. The big thing that's going to make people change their list build is that they changed one of their recommendations for how to run match play and competitive play, tournament play. That they had like the 3 detachment suggested limit up to 2,000 points. They're now also suggesting that you only allow data sheets to be used 3 times in an army, which is pretty big. So now that takes care of a lot of the spam issues that people are having. So, guard units with, guard armies with like 47 different mortar teams now can have 3 mortar teams. Still 9 mortars, still pretty good, but it means that you can't just rely on only those mortar teams to do the work. Same thing with Tyranids with the Flying Hive Tyrants. As opposed to having 9 Flying Hive Tyrants, you have 3. As opposed to having 9 Dark Talons, like an Adepticon, you now have 3. Same thing with everything, except the only exceptions are troops and dedicated transports. And to me, that sounds fine. I think the aim for GW with a lot of these adjustments, a lot of the point increases, a lot of these rule changes, a lot of these suggestion changes, they've arisen because they've specifically stated that they want to increase the diversity of lists in the game. And not just like that they want a whole lot of different lists, but they want to have diversity within lists. So to them, they don't want spam lists to go on. They want to be able to see a whole bunch of different units cooperating, working together in the synergy, because synergy is huge this edition, and that's a deliberate. I believe that was a deliberate aim in them designing 8th edition, was creating these synergies between units. Back in last edition, there wasn't as much synergy between units. You had HQs that could join units to help them out, but there wasn't really the synergy. But now that you have these aura bubbles, now that you have the way that with the stratagems that work with different units, so like with the telemetric targeting. So now if I have a land speeder within line of sight of a unit that my whirlwinds automatically hit, like, that's awesome. These are all meant to be synergies that are supposed to work together to help you prosecute the battle, and that was their aim with 8th edition, was to create more synergy. And they don't want the spam because it doesn't really help the game to have all this spam. That was always that's what people did in 7th edition, and I think going into 8th edition, people were doing the exact same thing. And that was the whole point, is that people came in and they're like, how can I spam? What am I going to spam? And that's why, like, the first major list that got nerfed that you saw was the Storm Raven spam. Now it's like, well, you can't have, if you've only got flyers, you're dead. Now you adjust that and you move on and you go on to the next thing. And then people kept trying to spam and spam and spam. So finally they came out and they said, we recommend that you only allow 3 of any one unit to work, in a list. And that's cool. If you were just doing a game at home, it's a recommendation. It is going to be, I think, a pretty popular recommendation, and I think it's going to be adopted by, ITC has already come out and said they're adopting all of it, and I think that most competitions, most tournaments are going to accept all of these changes, but so maybe start thinking about building lists that work with that. Shook up a lot of the competitive scene, shook up a lot of the competitive lists that you saw out there. You're no longer going to have 1,000 Dark Reapers on a Dark Reaper units in a list. You're not going to see the same. You're not going to see 9 Dark Talons in a list. So now you're going to see a lot more diversity within the list, and that's what GW wanted to do. So I think that change shook up a lot of lists. I think the no deep strike turn 1 shook up a lot of tactics. And I think that they also changed the. They also made it now so that when you're making a list and you have to choose the faction keyword, the keyword to make a faction, to make a list, to make a detachment, it now requires Imperium, Demon. I think it's Imperium, Demon, and Chaos. Anyway, the big umbrella ones that created the soup list was taken away. So now you're no longer going to have, you're no longer going to have like a Mephiston with 3 infantry squads to make a screening detachment for Imperials, because Imperial no longer counts for that. You can still mix. You can still have a guard detachment. You can still and a Blood Angels detachment. But you can't have an Inquisitor leading a bunch of guard. So now you require to have like a more specific keyword in order for that to work. They made some changes or exceptions to this, or not exceptions. They made some changes to allow you to do things. So, for instance, Legion of the Damned who is it? Legion of the Damned, the Assassins, and Sisters of Silence can now take Vanguard detachments without HQs. So basically, you can take 3 Assassins, counts as a Vanguard detachment, and you don't have to take an HQ to put it in there, because before you would have to put in. They don't have HQs. They don't have access to HQs. Neither does Legion of the Damned. Neither do the Sisters of Silence. So this now allows you to field them. It changes the command benefit to none, so you don't get any CP for that Vanguard, but it does allow you to field those units now without having to do the soup list. So they got rid of the soup detachments, but still made accommodations for those forces that don't have any HQs to be able to run them. So so soup is now gone. Soup detachments are gone. And so soup detachments are gone. You have no first turn deep strike, and you have 3 of the same unit, same data sheet per army. And suddenly you have a major shakeup to the game. And you have a major shakeup to the meta. You have a major shakeup to pretty much everything. So with that in mind, I think people have been understandably shook by the changes. But I hope that by the end of the week, people come back to it. I like the changes. I think they're fine. Would it have been nice to be able to drop my Sanguinary Guard first turn? Yes. Is my list gutted now because of it? No. Do I think that I cannot play them anymore because of it? No. I think that you're going to see a lot more parity between going first and going second now. That first turn is basically what's on the board. I think that you're going to see a lot more parity, a lot more diversity in lists now because of that the 3 data slate limit to armies, and I think that you're going to see. You're not going to see any soup list now because that is a rule. It is beta rules, and I know there's a lot of people that always happens every time they've come out with these beta rules where they say they're not official, we're not going to play with anything that's not official, and that's fine. Don't play with it if you don't want to, but the fact is the previous beta rules got adopted as full-fledged rules with minor changes, minor tweaks. So I would imagine that these beta rules are going to be real rules because when I look at them, they don't break the game and they don't ruin the game. You know, I know there's a lot of people that really think that they can't play this game anymore because they can't deep strike first turn. But I mean, what did you do the previous 7 editions when that wasn't a thing? I mean, deep strike is a relatively new addition to Warhammer in general, and first turn deep strike is only a thing this edition, you know, or the very end with some formations of 7th edition. So if the game could operate without first turn deep strike before, it can operate without it now. And I think that it's going to be fine. It requires, again, like I said, a pause and a rethink of strategy, maybe a rethink of list design. So if your entire list was dependent upon that first turn dropping in and being able to do something, maybe now you have to change your list around so that you've got some units that can hold strong on the table until your deep strikers can get in. If anything, this creates a situation that is going to require some forward thinking as well, because a lot of times I wouldn't drop my guys first turn because they had their back zone locked up. You know, they just had it all. It's real easy to screen out a deployment zone first turn because you deploy everybody back there. Everyone's got all these, 9 inches from every table edge, 9 inches or 18 inches from each other. Suddenly now you can't deep strike back there. So first turn, you're either coming right in front of them or you're not coming in at all. So oftentimes I would hold my guys to second or third turn anyway because of that. But now your opponent isn't going to see any deep strikers that first turn. So are they going to not screen as tightly because they don't have to worry about it first turn? Are they going to move their screens after that first turn because they want to be able to get into shooting range? So now if you're running deep strike assault heavy forces, maybe the strategy becomes first turn you have distraction units that are meant to draw the screen forward to give you those bubbles in the back zone that you can drop down to assault with. I I think that's going to be a great strategy. I think that's going to work real well, because what you're going to do is you're going to put them in a situation where it's like either they either move their screens forward to answer your units that are coming up into their face from the front, or they keep them back to screen out your units that are dropping in from deep strike. Either which way, you have found a way to mess with them, and it makes them think. And anytime you're making your opponent think, you're doing a benefit to your list, to your army, to your game. That's the whole point. There was also a major exception made to the deep strike rule. It's not the deep strike rule; it's the deployment rule. With Genestealer Cult, they excluded Genestealer Cult coming in from Cult Ambush from being held to that same rule, because the way they said it in the discussion they were having is that Genestealer Cult, the whole army is designed around that function. That's the whole thing of it. There's no other real response to it. That's what they're designed for, and that's what they're designed to do. And they said it didn't make sense to hold them back for that. So Genestealer Cult are still going to be coming in turn 1. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. See if that maybe boosts Genestealer Cult, because you don't really see them on the competitive scene other than a few units thrown into Tyranid lists. I think that this could help boost the whole army as a whole. I think it'd be interesting to see how that all plays out. They also excluded deployments that occur deployments that occur after deployment but before the first turn of play. So infiltrating, the Raven Guard move or redeploy that you can do. All of those things are still allowed. They made exceptions to the rule to that. So all of that should be interesting to see how it plays out. I think these are big changes. I think these are going to seriously affect the game. I think they're going to seriously affect how everything gets played out, but it'll be interesting to see how it does. So those are my thoughts. Obviously, I'd love to hear what you guys have to think. It's obviously the wounds are still raw. I get that. But I don't think that anger is necessarily the way to go. I don't think we need to make knee-jerk reactions to this yet. I've played one game with it only because it dropped in the middle of my game, and it had an effect, but it didn't destroy the game at all. So, let me know what you guys think down below. Keep the conversation going. I think it's a worthy conversation to have. And I think it's a thing. I think it's interesting to see how this all plays out. I'm really enjoying it. I also think that this is the surest sign that 8th edition might be the last edition of Warhammer 40,000 for at least a very, very long time. I think that the fact that they're making huge game mechanic changes in these FAQs and these things indicates that this really is the living rule system that they wanted it to be, because stopping first turn deep strike is a major mechanic change. That's the kind of thing that you would see change over editions. It changed from 7th to 8th, and that was one of the major differences that people noted, and now they've changed it back a bit. You still don't have to roll for it, so you still are more, reserve units are way more secure because of that. But you have they changed it back, and that's a major component. That's a major change, and I think that this is the biggest indicator that they are looking at 8th edition as the edition. And I've heard people say that it's not called that at GW they don't call it 8th edition. They just call it the Warhammer 40,000. That is just called Warhammer 40,000. They don't call it 8th edition. They don't have the assumption that they're moving on to a 9th edition. And I think that's true. And I think this is the biggest indicator that is true. I know they had mentioned it and they had talked about it, and these things have been talked about, but this seems to be the major move that to really show that that's the way it's going to be. So let me know what you guys think. Tell me what your plans are to respond to this. How do you think this is going to change your gameplay? How is this going to change your list building? Do you have any ideas? Is it still too fresh that you just have no idea? Let me know. Let me know down below. So I hope you guys have all enjoyed this. I certainly have. I have been Phil the Glacial Geek as always. And until next time, have fun.